we want to take a closer look at the verses themselves and how they describe this subject. And we want to see whether or not this actually accurately describes Jesus. So in Isaiah 52 verse 14 it says, "Surely his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men." And similarly in Isaiah 53 verse 2 it says, "He had no form nor comeliness that we should look upon him, nor beauty that we should delight in him." In other words, it's describing somebody that is so ugly, so disfigured, that it's difficult to look at him. That person hides their face and says, "I don't want to look at such a face." Now the question is, was Jesus hard to look at? Well, the real answer is, we don't know. Right? We don't have any pictures of Jesus. But if it counts for anything, how is Jesus portrayed in Christian art throughout the ages? Well, I've brought down here two pictures, but he doesn't look like someone that's hard to look at or disfigured. On the contrary, he looks like a beautiful man.
I don't even think this is a valid argument. The prophet describes the servant in his suffering. He's not talking about whether the servant is ugly or handsome. So I think it's completely unfair to compare paintings and drawings of the Messiah with the prophecy in Isaiah 53. The prophet made a description of the Messiah in his suffering, not about paintings from artists that don't even know what the Messiah looked like. To give an illustration on how incredibly silly this argument is, let's say some group in the Holocaust would be considered a righteous group, and they would look at the scriptures for comfort, and the rabbi gets to Isaiah 53, thinking it's about the righteous remnant of Israel. Then he would read Isaiah 52 verse 14 and start to single the handsome rabbis out and separate them from the group, saying, "Sorry brothers, this passage is not about you. You're just not ugly enough." How miserably silly would this understanding and application of this verse be? Now, I'm not saying this to mock you personally or something, but this is the argument that you make.
Moving on, we look at Isaiah 53 verse 3, and this is more serious. It says, "He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of pains and acquainted with disease, as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised and we esteemed him not." In other words, what's being described over here is somebody who is roundly despised and rejected. Somebody who people hide their faces from, people run away from him, and in general, he's somebody that is, again, as I mentioned, despised. Is that what we know about Jesus? So let's look in Luke chapter 2, verse 52. It says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." In other words, he became very popular. We know that the Gospels tell about all the miracles and all his preachings and healings. That made him so immensely popular that droves of people were coming to find him from all over. In Luke chapter 4 verse 14, "And Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit and into Galilee, and a report went out throughout all the neighborhood concerning him. And he taught in the synagogues, being glorified by all." And then again, if you look also in Mark chapter 3 verse 7 through 9, where it talks about how they had to have a boat ready to take him away because the crowds were crushing him. It was too much. It was unbearable. Does that describe somebody who's roundly rejected? Now, it is true that according to the records of the Gospels, at the end of Jesus' life, there was maybe a courtyard full of people that were calling for him to be crucified. However, we all have our group of enemies. We all have people who don't like us and wish to persecute us. However, when we talk about somebody that is going to be identified exclusively as being roundly rejected and despised, we mean something more than the ordinary. So Jesus had his opposers, we all do. But Jesus, at least according to the New Testament, is not somebody that we would characterize as somebody who is roundly despised and rejected.
Yes, this is exactly what we know about Yeshua. What you are doing, Rabbi, is taking a few verses where people are drawn to the Messiah when he started his ministry and say, see, he was loved by a lot of people. But I can do that with verses about Israel too. There are a bunch of verses where Israel is portrayed appealing. But it would be unfair to take those verses and say, see, Israel is loved by the nations. Therefore, this chapter and these specific verses are not about Israel. As I said, the servant is described in his suffering. In his suffering, he underwent everything on his own. He had some followers who completely left him when he got arrested. His close inner circle completely abandoned him, even denying him when people asked them about him. He was despised by his enemies and rejected by his friends in his suffering.